The last thing I expected to find at 2 in the morning was a dead man doing his job. But there he was, on screen 4, sitting at his desk, typing. I know what you're thinking. Maybe I was tired. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. I thought the same thing, so I rewound the footage, watched it again and again, same result every time. The man on that screen had been dead for 6 years. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I worked the overnight security shift at a regional transit authority, the kind of mid-sized operation that moves about 40,000 people a day. Buses, commuter rail lines, a dispatch center that runs around the clock, big enough to feel institutional, small enough that everyone knew everyone, or at least knew of everyone. I'd taken the job 8 months before any of this happened. I needed something stable after my last position fell through. Long story, not relevant. And night security at a transit hub seemed about as low stakes as you could get. Walk the perimeter every 2 hours, monitor the CCTV feeds, write incident reports for things that never happened. The most exciting night I'd had up until that point was chasing a raccoon out of the loading bay, and even that had felt like an overreaction. The pay was decent enough. The solitude was something I'd grown to appreciate. There's a particular kind of peace in being the only awake person in a large building at 3 in the morning. You start to notice things. The way sounds change when there's no foot traffic to absorb them. The way fluorescent lights hum at a slightly different frequency, depending on how cold it is outside. The way an empty hallway looks completely different at midnight versus noon, even though nothing about it has physically changed. I'd gotten comfortable in all of that. I'd started to feel like I understood the building. I was wrong about that. The security office was a windowless room on the ground floor of the main administrative wing, a square of maybe 200 square feet, with a desk, a bank of monitors, a mini fridge I kept my lunch in, and a rolling chair that had been broken in the exact same way since before I started, and would probably be broken in that same way long after I was gone. There were 14 cameras total covering the facility. I had a rotation set up on the main display, so each feed cycled through every 45 seconds. I knew every angle, every shadow, every blind spot. The dispatch center sat in the east wing. It was the nerve center of the whole operation, the room where coordinators managed routes, handled driver communications, tracked vehicles, and responded to incidents in real time. During the day it was loud, busy, full of voices overlapping, and keyboards clicking, and phones ringing. At night, it ran on a skeleton crew, 2 dispatchers on for the overnight window, rotating every 8 hours. I monitored 14 cameras. Screen 4 covered the main dispatch floor, and that's where I saw him. Before I get into that first night, I need to give you some context about the building itself, because it matters. The Transit Authority had been operating out of that facility since the mid-1980s. The administrative wing had been renovated twice, once in the late 90s, once about 10 years ago. But the East Wing, where dispatch lived, hadn't been touched in a long time. The bones of it were original, old drop-ceiling tiles with water stains so old they'd turned the color of tea. Fluorescent fixtures with that one panel that buzzed a little louder than the rest. A floor that was linoleum over concrete and made a specific hollow sound when you walked on it in the wrong spot near the far wall. I'd done my interior rounds through that room probably 200 times since I'd started. I knew it well enough to walk it in the dark. The workstations were arranged in a slight curve, facing a large board of real-time system monitors, bus locations, rail schedules, incident alerts. There were 3 seats total. The 2 primary workstations were on the right side, angled slightly toward each other, so the overnight dispatchers could communicate without raising their voices. The 3rd station, on the far left, sat isolated from the others. More desk space, older equipment, a separate phone line. It had been Raymond Callis's seat. I didn't know that yet. At the time, it was just a chair that was usually empty. The overnight dispatchers had told me early on, without much explanation, that they didn't use that workstation, not because anything was wrong with it, not because there was a policy against it, just they didn't. When I'd asked Dev about it once during a corridor crossover around 1 a.m., he'd shrugged and said, "That's just Ray's seat." I'd assumed Ray was a current employee on a different shift and hadn't thought about it again. That was my first mistake. Not asking follow-up questions. It was a Tuesday in late November. I remember because Tuesdays were when they restocked the vending machine in the break room, and I'd been looking forward to those cheese crackers all week, which tells you exactly how much was happening on a typical overnight shift. I'd done my 1 a.m. perimeter check, logged it, poured my third coffee of the night, and settled back into the chair. The building was quiet, the way old buildings get quiet after midnight. Not silent, but full of small sounds that you stop registering after a while. The hum of the HVAC, pipes shifting somewhere in the walls, the distant mechanical sound of a bus pulling out of the yard. Normal sounds, comfortable sounds. I was cycling through the feeds. Loading dock, empty. Parking structure, a handful of employee vehicles, nothing moving. East stairwell, empty. Maintenance corridor, empty. Dispatch floor. I paused. There were supposed to be 2 dispatchers on overnight. I'd seen both of them when I did my interior walk at midnight. Carla, who I recognized from the shift crossover handoffs, and a younger guy named Dev, who I'd spoken to maybe a dozen times total, both at their primary stations, both looking exactly the way people look at midnight when they have 6 more hours ahead of them and they've made peace with it. But what I was looking at now was different. There was a third person at the far left workstation. He was sitting with his back mostly to the camera, which was mounted high in the rear corner of the room. Navy dispatch uniform, headset on, the older style, the kind with the curved boom mic that came down at a steeper angle than the newer models. His posture was slightly forward, the way someone sits when they've been at a desk long enough that upright stopped being comfortable. His hands were on the keyboard, moving. Carla and Dev were at their stations. Neither of them had moved. Neither of them was looking at him. I told myself it was a supervisor, an early arrival, someone who'd come in to cover for a sick call I hadn't been informed about. There were at least 4 reasonable explanations, and I went through all of them in about 10 seconds before picking up my radio and calling Carla's desk. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice the specific kind of casual that means you're trying not to sound concerned. "You guys got a third in there tonight. Somebody come in early." A pause. Not long, maybe 2 seconds, but just slightly longer than the pause a person makes when the answer is an obvious no. "No," she said. "Just me and Dev." "Why?" I looked at screen 4. He hadn't moved. "No reason," I said. "Must have been a shadow." "All good." I hung up. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think people expect the story to go a certain way. They expect me to say I was terrified, that I felt the hair stand up on my arms, that some primal part of me knew immediately that what I was seeing was wrong, and maybe that happened on some level. But what I mostly felt in that exact moment was confused. The specific confusion of someone who is looking at something that doesn't fit any category they have available. My brain kept searching for the slot to file it in and kept coming up empty. I watched him for 4 more minutes without moving. He never looked up. He just kept typing. Steady, methodical, like someone working through a long task they'd done 1,000 times before. And then the feed cycled to the next camera on rotation. And by the time it cycled back, 45 seconds later, the seat was empty. I've told this story a handful of times since it happened. To my sister, to a friend I trust. Once, in a roundabout way, to a therapist I stopped seeing for unrelated reasons. Every time I tell it, people want me to skip to the part where I explain what it was, where I give them the answer that makes it make sense. I can't do that. What I can tell you is what happened next. What I started digging up about that building, and about that seat, and about the man who used to sit in it. And I promise you, the more I found out, the less I wanted to know. I didn't call it in that first night. Looking back, I should have, but some part of me, the part that had spent 8 months writing incident reports about raccoons, didn't want to be the person who filed a report claiming they'd seen a ghost on a security monitor. So instead, I did what I always do when I don't know what I'm dealing with. I started looking things up. The transit authority had an internal employee portal. Clunky, poorly maintained, the kind of system that had been implemented in the early 2000s and updated just enough times since then to stay functional without ever becoming intuitive. It had an employee directory with photos, titles, departments, employment history. I pulled up the dispatch department and started going through faces. The resolution on screen 4 wasn't great. It never was on that particular camera. Something about the angle and the overhead lighting washing things out. But I'd gotten enough of a look at the figure to have a rough profile. Male, middle-aged or close to it, broad through the shoulders. That particular forward hunch that comes from decades of desk work, the kind that eventually becomes the natural shape of a person, even when they're standing. I found him on the 3rd page of dispatch department employees. Raymond Callis, lead night dispatcher. The photo in the directory was from years back. His hair was darker, his face a little fuller, the kind of difference that accumulates over time, but is hard to pinpoint specifically. But the jaw was the same, the build was the same, the posture in the photo, and I know this sounds strange to say about a headshot, but bear with me. The posture in the photo was the same, that slight forward lean, like he was already reaching for a keyboard that wasn't in the frame. I clicked on his profile to pull up the full record. I don't know exactly what I expected to find. Retired maybe, transferred, on indefinite leave. Something that would explain why his name had apparently become attached to a workstation that no one used, and why a younger dispatcher had referred to it as Ray's seat, with the specific reverence people reserve for something they've been told to leave alone. What I found instead was a small grey banner at the top of his record, the kind of banner that the system generated automatically, in plain text, no formatting, just the facts. Deceased, April 14th, 2018, and below that, in the notes field, a paragraph that someone, HR probably, or whoever had been responsible for updating the record after the fact, had added. Raymond Callis passed away unexpectedly during his overnight shift. He was found unresponsive at his workstation at approximately 3:47 a.m. by the arriving morning crew. Cause of death was determined to be a cardiac event. Raymond had been with the transit authority for 22 years and was deeply respected by his colleagues and the dispatch department. His family has been notified. His workstation, found unresponsive at his workstation. I looked at the timestamp on my monitor. It was 2:14 a.m. I looked at screen 4. The seat was still empty. I didn't sleep when I got home that morning. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to build an explanation that worked. Equipment malfunction. A contractor or temp I hadn't been briefed on. Fatigue-related misperception. I'd read somewhere that sleep deprivation could cause visual anomalies, brief hallucinations, pattern recognition errors. My brain had found a face in grainy CCTV footage and matched it to the nearest available photo. That was possible. That was a reasonable thing that could happen. I almost convinced myself. 3 weeks passed, nothing unusual. I watched screen 4 a little longer each night than I had before, and nothing happened, and I slowly started to lower the story from active crisis to background noise in my head. Something strange had happened. I couldn't fully explain it. Probably there was an explanation. Let it go. Then it happened again. Same time window. Somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m. Same seat, same uniform, same posture. But this time was different, in a way that I'm going to have trouble describing accurately, because I don't think there are quite the right words for it. He was more present. That's the best I can do. The first time, there had been a quality to what I was seeing that I could almost attribute to a trick of the light, a compression artifact in the video feed, something that was at least halfway in the realm of technical explanation. This time, there was none of that. He was solid, defined. I could see the specific way his left hand rested slightly off-center on the keyboard compared to his right. I could see the headset cord running down from the earpiece and disappearing behind the desk. I could see the reflection of his monitor in his glasses. I hadn't noticed before that he wore glasses, but he did, and in that reflected light, I could almost make out what was on the screen. Roots. It looked like Roots. Carla was at her station. Dev was at his. The room was operating exactly the way it operated every night. And then Raymond Callis turned his head, not toward his colleagues, not toward the door on the far side of the room, toward the camera, toward the lens mounted in the upper rear corner of the room, toward me. I don't know how long I sat there. My body had gone into a kind of stillness that wasn't voluntary, not the frozen stillness of fear exactly, more like the stillness of a system that has received information it doesn't have a process for, and has temporarily stopped while it figures out what to do. My coffee was in my hand. I didn't put it down. I didn't move at all. He held that position, face toward the camera, patient, unmoving, not like someone who had heard a noise and glanced up reflexively, like someone who had been waiting for a specific moment and had recognized that the moment had arrived. After what felt like a very long time but was probably closer to 40 seconds, I reached out slowly and hit the clip save function on the recorder. Then I found a USB drive in my desk drawer, exported the last 10 minutes of footage, and held it in my hand for a moment, just to confirm that it was real and solid, and that I had actually just done that. Then I called my supervisor. Gerald was the kind of man who had survived 30 years in facilities management by being extremely difficult to rattle. I'd seen him respond to a burst pipe in the administrative wing with the same energy most people use to order coffee. When I reached him the following morning and told him I needed to show him something from the overnight footage, he said, "All right," in the tone of a man who had heard stranger things before breakfast. He watched the clip twice. He didn't say anything for a long time. And that silence, from a man who reacted to burst pipes like they were minor inconveniences, told me more than anything else could have. The woman who showed up the next afternoon introduced herself as being from the Regional Authority's Facilities and Compliance Office. She had a name that I've intentionally left out of this account for reasons I'll explain later. She was somewhere in her 50s, efficient in the way career bureaucrats get efficient. No wasted movements, no unnecessary words. The particular economy of someone who spent a lot of time managing situations that other people found difficult. She went into the security room alone and spent 6 hours reviewing archived footage. I sat in the break room and ate 3 bags of vending machine crackers and tried to read a book on my phone and failed completely. When she came out, she looked like someone who had confirmed something they had been hoping not to confirm. She asked me 2 questions. When you were hired, were you given any orientation regarding the history of the dispatch center specifically? No. Have you spoken to any other current employees about what you observed on the footage? No. She nodded, thanked me, said the footage had been flagged for internal review, and that I should continue my regular duties and direct any further observations through the standard incident report process. She said this last part, looking at a point just slightly above my left shoulder, rather than at my face, which I registered as significant in a way I couldn't articulate. She left. Gerald found me afterward and told me, with considerable gentleness for a man who wasn't generally given to gentleness, that some things about old buildings were better left at the level of, "I don't know," rather than pushed toward explanation. He said it in a way that suggested he was giving me advice rather than direction, and that he was giving it from experience. I thanked him, and then, because I am apparently the kind of person who cannot leave things alone, I went home and started making calls. Her name was Eloise. She'd worked in dispatch for 14 years before retiring, and she'd overlapped with Raymond Callis for most of that time. I found her through a community transit enthusiast forum, the kind of place that attracts former employees who still care enough to follow the updates, and sent her a message that was vague enough not to be alarming, but specific enough that she'd understand I was asking about something more than general history. She called me back within 2 hours. She talked about Raymond the way people talk about someone they genuinely miss, not performing grief, just quietly sad in the way you get when enough time has passed that the loss has settled into you permanently. She said he was the kind of person that a department like overnight dispatch couldn't really function without, not because he was management or because he had authority, but because he was the one who knew how everything actually worked. The undocumented knowledge, the informal systems, the specific way you had to word a radio call to get the South Yard crew to respond faster, the route alternatives that weren't in any handbook, but that Ray had memorized over years of watching the network develop. When he died, she said, it wasn't just that they lost a colleague, it was that they lost the institutional memory of 22 years. And a lot of that memory had never been written down anywhere, because Raymond had never needed to write it down. She talked for about 20 minutes before I asked her about the disciplinary review. There was a pause. "Who told you about that?" she asked. I said I'd found references to an incident in some of the archived reports, which was partly true. I'd found fragments. She was quiet for a moment, and then she told me. In the winter of 2017, about 4 months before Raymond died, there had been a severe weather event. Freezing rain, black ice on several of the primary corridors, the kind of conditions that compressed every decision into something with immediate consequences. Raymond had been on shift. He'd made a routing call, diverted a bus to a secondary road to avoid what the system was flagging as a delay on the main route. The secondary road turned out to be worse than the main route. The bus had lost traction on an incline. The driver had managed to stop without a major accident, but a passenger had been thrown forward and hurt her shoulder and arm, badly enough to require surgery. The internal review had been filed the following week, standard procedure for any incident resulting in passenger injury. Raymond had been formally notified that the review was underway. He was devastated, Eloise said. Not about the review. He didn't care about the review. He cared that someone got hurt because of a decision he made. He kept saying he should have known the secondary road would be worse. He kept saying he should have checked the updated conditions first. He went over it 100 times. I told him it was a judgment call in impossible conditions, and anyone could have made the same call, but he couldn't let it go. She paused again. He told me, the week before he died, that he didn't know how to walk away from it. He meant the guilt. He wasn't going to do anything dramatic. I want to be clear about that. He just meant that he couldn't stop turning it over. He'd been a dispatcher for 22 years, and he'd never had someone get hurt on his watch, and he didn't have any internal framework for what to do with that. I said I understood. He died in that chair, she said. In the middle of a shift, hands on the keyboard, headset on. He'd been working. They found him that way. She didn't say anything after that for a moment. I hope he found some peace, she said finally. I really do. I didn't tell her what I'd seen on the cameras. Some things you don't say out loud, because saying them out loud makes them more real, in a way you're not ready for. The third time I saw Raymond Callis was on a Thursday in January, 4 weeks after the second incident, 11 weeks after the first. I had started keeping a log by then, dates, times, camera, duration. I'd told myself it was just documentation, good practice. What I was actually doing was looking for a pattern, the way you do when the alternative is accepting that something is happening that doesn't have a pattern, and that possibility is worse. It was 3:41 a.m. when he appeared, 6 minutes earlier than the previous incidents. I noticed that immediately and wrote it down. He was at the workstation as before, uniform, headset, hands moving. The same deliberate, focused quality of someone working through a complex task. But something else was different this time. The screen in front of him was active. I could see it clearly enough on the camera. The colors, the layout. It was the dispatch management system, the real-time route management interface, live data, current routes, active vehicles, and he was doing something with it. I pulled up the dispatch management system on my own terminal. I had read-only access for security monitoring purposes, and looked at the overnight data. The system was showing a reroute flag on line 7, a secondary road diversion, redirecting the 3:38 a.m. run away from the main corridor on Harwick and onto Belmont Avenue. I looked at that for a very long time. Belmont Avenue was a reasonable secondary option. Not ideal, it added about 4 minutes to the route, but reasonable. Nothing alarming about it on paper. I opened the external weather monitoring app on my phone. Current conditions, overnight temperatures, road surface data from the municipal sensors. Harwick Road was showing 2 isolated ice patches in the last quarter mile before the transit center, the section with the steepest grade on the route. The patches had been flagged in the last update at 3:33 a.m. The reroute on the system had been entered at 3:39 a.m. The bus on line 7 ran that corridor at 3:38 a.m., give or take. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I looked at screen 4. Raymond Callis was still at his workstation, still working, and for the first time since this had started, I didn't feel afraid. I felt something closer to sad, a profound, quiet sadness that I wasn't entirely prepared for. The feeling of understanding something you wish you didn't understand, something that would have been easier to leave alone. At 3:47 a.m. exactly, the workstation went dark. Not the monitor, the whole station. The faint glow of the standby lights on the equipment, the subtle indicator that something was powered and present. All of it, at once, in a way that didn't correspond to any shutdown sequence I'd ever seen on that system. And then it came back up, standby mode, same as it always was. The dispatch management system no longer showed a reroute flag on line 7. Whatever he had done, it had gone through the system the same way a live entry would, and then been cleared, the way shifts are cleared when they're completed. I know how this sounds. I know that everything I just described exists on the very edge of what a reasonable person can accept. I know there are explanations I haven't fully ruled out. System glitches, software errors, someone else entering data remotely. A chain of coincidences that my sleep-deprived brain assembled into a narrative because that's what human brains do. They build stories out of unconnected things because a story is easier to hold than a collection of separate facts that don't relate to each other. I've considered all of that, but I looked up the incident logs for line 7 from that night. The 3:38 a.m. run completed without incident. No delays, no road condition issues. Arrived at the transit center at 3:54 a.m., 2 minutes behind scheduled, within normal variance. If the bus had stayed on Harwick Road and hit those ice patches on the grade, I don't know. Maybe nothing would have happened. Maybe the driver would have navigated it fine. Maybe there would have been another report filed with HR about a passenger injury, and another dispatcher sitting at another desk somewhere, turning it over and over, unable to walk away from it. I don't know. I'll never know. What I know is what I saw. I put in my notice the following Monday. I gave the standard 2 weeks, but used my accumulated leave to effectively finish that Friday. Gerald processed the paperwork without comment. He did stop me on my way out on the last night and put his hand briefly on my shoulder, which was more than he'd ever done in 8 months, and said, "You did good work here." He didn't elaborate. I didn't ask him to. I've kept the USB drive. I haven't watched the footage on it since the night I saved it. I've thought about it many times. I've picked it up and turned it over in my hand and put it back down again. Someday, maybe. Not yet. What I've thought about most, in the time since, isn't the fear. The fear has faded to something more manageable. An elevated heart rate, when I drive past a transit building at night, a habit of glancing at security monitors when I walk past them in stores or airports, a specific discomfort with the sound of a keyboard in an otherwise quiet room. That stuff is background noise now. You get used to it. What I've thought about is Raymond Callis. 22 years of overnight shifts. 22 years of showing up in the dark while the rest of the city slept, managing the invisible infrastructure that moved 40,000 people from one place to another every single day. Most of those people never thought about dispatch. Most of them never thought about the fact that someone was awake at 3 a.m. making decisions that kept their commute running. They just got on the bus and went where they were going. Raymond made one bad call in a bad situation. Someone got hurt. He couldn't forgive himself for it. And then he died at his desk, in the middle of a shift, with his hands on the keyboard, still trying to get it right. I think about what Eloise said, that he didn't know how to walk away from it. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe it's that simple and that heartbreaking. Maybe some people are so completely defined by the work they do, so thoroughly built around their purpose, that when something in that purpose breaks, when they make a mistake they can't absorb, can't contextualize, can't move past, there is no version of them that exists outside of trying to fix it, over and over, shift after shift, long after anyone is keeping track, long after they're even alive to be asked. I don't go back to that building. I don't drive past it if I can help it. I have a different job now, days only, small company, nothing that requires me to be awake at 3 a.m. in an empty building watching screens. But some nights, and I'll be honest with you, it happens more than I'd like. I'll be lying in bed in the small hours when the city is quiet, and I'll hear something soft, rhythmic, coming from nowhere I can identify. And I'll think about a man at a desk in a room that no one is supposed to be in, doing the job that was his entire life, making sure the buses run safe. And I'll think about the fact that wherever he is, whatever it is that he's doing when I can't see him, I think he's still there, still at his station, still getting it right. I don't know if that's the most terrifying thing I've ever encountered, or the most human, maybe both. Maybe that's always been the same thing.